So now may I invite the speakers in the afternoon session to come forward to the stage. And we are very happy to have Professor Hills to help us to chair this panel. Professor Hills is a chair professor at the Kaduri Institute at the University of Hong Kong. And he joined the then Center of Urban Studies and Urban Planning at the University of Hong Kong back in the year 2008. In 1992, he was appointed director of the renamed Center of Urban Planning and Environmental Management, and he held this position until year 2008 when, following the reorganization of CUPIN, he was appointed the director of the Kaduri Institute. Professor Hills has served on many of the Hong Kong government advisory bodies, including the Energy Advisory Committee and the Advisory Council on the Environment. So we are very happy to have Professor Hills to chair. Thank you.
Thanks, Daphne, for that very kind introduction. Well, we've reached the end of the day. I've been fascinated, and I think we'd all agree that we've heard such an amazing variety of viewpoints on smart grid developments and their implications. It's been for me, a very valuable learning experience to hear all these different perspectives and the insights that our speakers have offered. Just by way of a very quick introduction to this panel discussion, just a couple of things that have struck me. Firstly, the amazing diversity of the concept and the practice of the smart grid. There is no one single model, technically, policy-wise, and when we look at the experiences that we've been exposed to from different parts of the world, it's quite clear that there are many adaptive processes going on which produce these different outcomes. Although in one general sense, they're all focused on the same ultimate objective, which is to give us much more modern energy systems that use energy, particularly electricity, of course, more efficiently. The second set of issues appeal to me because of some of the things that I've been interested in as a researcher. And this is really the broad issue of trust and the way that trust pervades the smart grid area, whether it's some of the issues that Elizabeth was talking about, which I thought really, touch on issues of trust in those non-accountable institutions, which in a way, the fact that the TROs, right? Yeah, RTOs. The way in which they've emerged in a country which often is preoccupied with accountability and so on seems quite fascinating. And some of the issues that Robin raised about fears about the surveillance society, trust in who has your data, how it's used, and so on. I'm not talking about trust here solely in relation to that well-established international concern about privacy and so on, but I think it goes wider than that. So those are a couple of themes to kick off the panel discussion. So I throw it open to the floor, and you're very welcome to make any observations or pose any questions. So it's over to you. Yes.
Good afternoon. I'm Prentice from WWF. I think it's really a pity that we miss John here, because what he mentioned is about reliability. And the key of the smart grid is actually about who is taking control of the grid. Either RTO or the utilities taking control. I really wonder how RTO is going to solve the problem of reliability, because John have mentioned about the blackout in North America in early 2000. So there must be some solution or response of the so-called smarter grid in order to deal with the problem of reliability.
So reliability in the U.S. really spurred the creation and management of the, sorry, this is when jet lag kicks in, the National Electric Reliability Council, NERC. And so they have a series of standards. This is a private council. They have a series of standards and rules. And for years, there were different reliability organizations that were not contiguous but overlapping with the RTOs. Currently, the RTOs have taken on that function of reliability. And in some ways, they were really spurred to do so by the FERC. So this linkage of reliability, and here I'm only talking about the high voltage system. I mean, most of the problems in terms of blackouts are happening on the low voltage distribution network. They're happening for things like trees and squirrels and raccoons that get in and munch up the system, right? And so when you're thinking about the reliability question, we give a lot of attention to these high-profile cascading blackouts. Researchers study them I don't want to say ad nauseum, I mean, I don't mean to disparage this, but we spend so much effort trying to understand how these systems work. We know they're nonlinear. We've seen the different models. But when you actually look at where they're happening, most of it's happening because we're not trimming trees, because squirrels get into your junction boxes. I mean, so the reliability issue for the RTO is definitely part of keeping the grid running. But if you look at the reliability, it's actually quite good. Actually, when Superstorm Sandy hit, we have a bunch of interviews from New York because we looked at kind of the effect of smart grid on Superstorm Sandy. And one of the best quotes came from one of the RTOs there that said, you know what, we kept the power on up to 42nd Street. We can't help it if your substation's underwater. And for me, what this highlighted was this tension between adaptation and mitigation when it comes to climate change, but also some of the limits when we talk about system planning and the electric grid. If it's underwater, you have to do something else. But the reliability piece of the high voltage system in North America is actually much better than the distribution networks that, that Dr. Cheng was talking about. And there's quite a difference among specific utilities as well.
Yeah, maybe I can just say a few words on that as well as on trust. The interesting thing in the Netherlands is that ever since the liberalization of the energy market, the people who actually manage the transmission lines, the distribution lines, people have no opinion on them. So in all the surveys that are being done, they are considered very reliable, very trustworthy organizations. But if you ask someone on the street, who manages the local powerhouse, who manages your local connection, they don't know who they are. They are completely distrusting of energy, of the big energy companies, of the private companies, the ones that sell you the electricity. Even though their connection, they are sometimes not even properly cut off from, not properly separated from the public utilities. So it is interesting that when there's a blackout, people start blaming the electricity company, the ones that sell them the electricity, instead of the ones that are managing it. So if we're talking about trust and reliability, and especially on the smart grid, and accepting sort of new standards of risk and blackouts and avoiding that, if you want to have a public debate on that, people first need to be educated in one way before they can formulate opinions on that. That goes for the Dutch case, definitely.
Just a comment on that. Actually, it's because you said the distribution networks were owned by state companies, right? Are they municipalities?
At the moment, the distribution companies, they are regional. So there's 4 distribution utility companies. Mm-hmm. They are companies, but they're publicly owned, and they have societal goals.
So they're not profit-oriented?
No, they're not. They are marked by the government on their reliability, affordability, etc. And they are funded and paid for via energy taxes, so via the government.
Okay, because it's the other way around in Sweden, for example. There's a lot of criticism about electricity distribution companies, which are private, even though it's a regulated. Oh, sorry, even though it's a regulated business. So I mean, it depends on the country as well. Even though we have a liberal market as well, but there, for example, there's more distrust against electricity distribution companies than actually retail companies, because a lot of people think that the electricity market functions well, whereas distribution companies may be abusing their monopoly power. And especially if they're internationally owned, there's of course more controversy. So yeah.
One of the things I found really interesting, we just had a workshop 2 weeks ago where we looked at distribution network planning, and we invited a bunch of the distribution network planners from several utilities. And the gap between how we deal with the high voltage system where it's planned, you know, it's multi-billion dollars, $1 million a mile, versus the resources that the distribution network engineers had was really staggering. In one of the cooperative utilities, they talked about how they would run their planning model, and then they would download everything into Excel, where they would subtract by hand all of the distributed energy resources. And that they had $2 million a year to invest and $88 million in need. And that, you know, right now we don't have the same financing mechanisms in the United States for the distribution network planning. And for me, this gap between the smart grid image and ideal and how we actually manage and operate the distribution networks was really striking. I think on the high voltage side, we do it a lot better. And the people at our conference talked about, you know, the distribution network conversation in North America is where the transmission conversation was back in 1990. And so this gap between the systems that we talk about here in our smart grid meetings and actually how it happens in practice with a woman with, you know, 44 years of unmet need, 3 workers, one who's 80, one who's 65, and one who's 57, you know, running the system, I think was really striking. And so that's a piece that we haven't yet gotten to, but I think this distribution network angle and planning is really going to be an exciting place for research in the future. So it's nice to see you guys interested in it from different angles.
So may I add a couple of observations following the discussion just now? So first is about the regulatory competence. So the experience in America is that this organization, even though it's an NGO, it seems to be quite a competent and quite credible organization that deal with tensions and then sort out conflicts, and then there are some sort of regulatory arrangement. So I think regulators' roles are very important in the context of smart grid. So how to build up the competence, regulatory competence, and these regulators, they are seen to be competent, is also very important. So it seems that across different countries, these may differ a lot. So I just wonder, would you like?
Well, so in the U.S. with our energy federalism model, the distribution network in all of our traditionally regulated states is regulated by our public utility commissions. And these commissions were created over 100 years ago to deal with this idea of reliable, affordable, accessible electricity. I mean, this was something that was negotiated and it's put in statute. These other policy goals we have with renewables and efficiency were added much, much later. And so now we're asking these public utility commissions to do something very different. I'm actually here and I'm missing a meeting that we have studying public utility commissions because they vary considerably by state. There are some that have 5 members, there are some that have 3 members, there are some that are appointed by governors, there are some that are elected. And the statutory authority of these organizations allows them to do very different things. That said, many of the people who serve on them don't have much prior experience in the energy sector, and some of the decisions they've made and the governance challenges that they have because of the statutory authority can be really limiting. For example, in Minnesota, for the first time now, the legislature passed a bill that allows one of the utilities to look at distribution network planning and pass those costs along. Before that was, you know, supposed to be internal to the utility itself. So how these costs are passed along and how they're managed really does happen at the state level. And they're varied. At one point, New Mexico had 3, and none of them had a college education. So.
Okay, right at the back.
Thank you for all the great presentation. I would like to ask a question to Daphne on the comparative policy or politics between China and Japan on smart grid. But what if you extend that comparative study between Japan and Korea instead of China, because you already have done Korea smart grid policy. Because we all know that they're so different between Japan and China, but in many sense, there are a lot of similarities in terms of energy-wise, in policies and supply and demand in Japan and Korea. So, what would you expect? You can see the similarities or differences if you compare two countries.
Actually, our whole project includes South Korea as well. So we actually has published a paper on Korea. But I think now when we move on the second round, John, our researcher, no, it's okay. And then we find that the language barrier is too difficult for us to overcome in South Korea. And then we are very fortunate to have Professor Wu with us, who is very fluent in Japanese and then in Mandarin. So Professor Wu was the very important bridge for us to overcome the language barrier in Japan. So I think the overall idea is that it would be good to include South Korea in the comparative study. And then in my presentation, what we work quite hard is to build a comparative framework so that we can put all these cases nicely on a comparable outline so that we can find out the similarities and differences, and then we can go on and explain why there are differences, why there are similarities, what are the factors underpinning all these patterns that we can draw out. So with that in mind, I'm sure that South Korea could be included in our study, but it's the language barriers that we need to take care of.
Okay, there was a question here.
So the question is two questions. Thanks. When we talk about smart grid and next years, China may have a continued reform on deregulation. So that was the first one happened in 2002 and start 30 years now. So next year probably will resume. So how this new technological breakthrough, for example, if you have more advanced smart grid, how this new idea or this new technology, this new set of new things could change the regulatory, so the change reform next year is incoming reform on deregulation of the electric market. That's the first question. The second question is
in China?
In China and other, so in general things. So how this new smart grid will change the regulation versus deregulation? Because this idea, deregulation has been a trend for a long time, but smart grid is relatively newer. So how this one can affect the deregulation thought. Second one is about innovation. So when we talk about, we're talking about renewables, talking about different new things. Hopefully in the coming years we'll make the renewables even cheaper, even more reliable. We can improve our things. We can expect probably some new energy resources to come into play to do these new things. So we don't know. We have a lot of uncertainties about innovation. And how this smart grid can encourage innovation on different fields, different companies, new startups, new ideas. How can this one encourage a better future? Thanks.
So if I may start in responding to the first question is about the very near future of the regulatory reforms and the relationship with smart grid. So it's a highly interactive components between regulatory reforms and smart grid deployment. So I think when we look at what have been happening in terms of smart grid in Japan, in South Korea, in China, it seems that smart grids are still in the very early stage. So now, like in Japan, it's kind of moving into the second phase of development. So scaling up with the support with business models, market rules changes, these would be the critical aspect to determine whether smart grid would be able to scale up from pilot project, demonstration project, to fuller scale of the deployment. And then in China, I think similar situation also emerged that, say, because of the dynamic pricing still haven't been introduced in the mainland China. And then so that is kind of great limitations to the wider scale of smart grid, because we do have limitations in pursuing demand response, consumer engagement, that sort of thing, without a dynamic pricing system. So these are also very related to regulatory changes. But I think the interaction can be very different, like in the mainland China. We don't see that it's the bottom-up changes that can affect regulatory reforms. It's more like the national government out of the very strategic national perspective of all other major energy issues like energy security. And then these are somehow related to smart grid. So sometimes changes are introduced in the regulatory frameworks because of other bigger energy issues or bigger energy considerations. It's not because that there are some smart grid developments in localities in China that move back, build up pressure for the national government to reform the market so that it will be more conducive to smart grid. It's not the case in China. So it's more bottom-up forces of change to smart grid. So you can feel that the prospect of smart grid is not very, very promising, because smart grid, like in mainland China, I think is not still a very big forces of change. They are kind of in niche forces of change, and is affected by many other bigger forces. Yeah.
So I'm going to disagree just slightly, because I think if you take the broad definition of smart grid, that encompasses both the high voltage and the low voltage system, and if you look at all of the investment they've made in wires in China, we were talking earlier about the new HVDC lines and everything like this. For China, that's how they've been kind of defining smart grid. I think it's an interesting country as well. You mentioned the 70% of energy that's consumed by the industrial sector. I hadn't appreciated until a few months ago how the dispatch policy that guarantees each operator, at least 50%, 60% time to ensure they can recover their costs also affects this. And so there have been a few kind of, green pricing models. One in Sichuan, I don't know how you do that. You dispatch hydro on top of hydro. And so thinking about kind of those pieces in China as well. I'm really interested in this from a climate commitment perspective also, because you're looking at an electricity market and a carbon tax in a place where both prices of generation are fixed and prices of consumption are fixed. So how you do a carbon tax in a system without a market remains for me kind of a puzzle. But maybe we can talk about this later. Within the North American context, I think some of the exciting places for this conversation are, our conversations with restructuring really stalled after Enron. And when California kind of melted down with the Enron debacle, in part because of the way they'd structured their markets, a policy decision leading to kind of large-scale crisis and corruption, it really hasn't, most of the states that even thought about before kind of froze. The idea now of a distribution level deregulation or restructuring is stuff that we're modeling now. How would this happen with distributed energy resources? So as researchers, we're thinking about this. I don't think the policymakers yet have the appetite for this. And I think your question of innovation is really a good one. Within the RTO example that I gave, one of the things that's been really critical for wind were the sub-hourly market clearing. The fact that the market clears every 5 minutes makes it possible for wind to follow pretty quickly. In California, for example, they were asking the wind to bid in and finalize their bid 90 minutes before, and that wasn't working as well. So I think one of the frontiers that people are looking at in terms of the wind farms, there are two areas that I think are really interesting. One is we currently run each turbine on its own, where each turbine control system maximizes its generation and minimizes its load. And NREL, the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, estimates that you lose 25 to 30% of potential wind plant power because of turbine-to-turbine turbulence and interactions. So creating control systems that run the plant as a plant, where you're maximizing power over the plant, may mean that each turbine operates at 80% by changing its yaw pitch, but the total power produced by the farm goes up. That also means that wind could potentially provide its own ancillary services, its own load following and grid management services. But that would, again, require changes in the market rules. Currently, wind and solar are forbidden for participating in ancillary service markets. Currently, those markets are structured on an hourly basis, but changes in how those are structured could potentially open new revenue streams for the technologies as well. And so my favorite collaboration right now is with a fellow in aerospace engineering, Pete Seiler, who works on wind control systems. He goes, okay, Elizabeth, what do you want the turbine to do? I'm like, well, Pete, what do you want the market rules to be? And coming at it together, I think, as researchers is really exciting, because you end up with different places where you can ask the questions, and understanding how these would be negotiated, I think, is pretty interesting.
We're running out of time. Professor Abe has a question or comment, and Professor Wu as well? No? Okay. So I think we need to make this the last one. Okay. All right.
Okay. I have very simple question, and please answer very simply. If you have two choice, what is a smart grid? The answer A is a new type of control and management system of the whole grid system. And B is new type of services for the customer. This is my question.
I could start with that. I would definitely favor the service as the second option there, because I think it's also very important to empower consumers to take action on their beliefs. I mean, right now, consumers only get insight into their energy consumption every half year when they pay the electricity bill. There's a lot of goodwill, a lot of motivation to start engaging more with energy, also get renewable energy, for example. But if people don't have insight into their own energy, if they don't have associated services, let's say, then this is a major hurdle in getting more people to become more renewable, more sustainable. So definitely the second option.
Lady at the back in yellow.
Hi, I have one question. For example, take the case of China. And during the last 2 weeks, there were a lot of reports about, there is a high possibility that the government may not be going to give heavy subsidies to all the renewable energy industries in mainland China. And as we all know, most of these industries were already, in the red, for years, And electricity output is one of the most important indicators of contribution to the GDP of mainland China as well. So, under this kind of situation, the government support and subsidies is one of the most important factors affecting, for example, various considerations, like, for example, whether various parts of the supply and demand are going to or willing to contribute, invest, in the future development, etc. I think this factor have to be taken into account in all the research, in the short, medium, and long run. And that's my comment.
Yeah, I am. Yeah, I want to ask two different questions, because from the cost effectiveness, the disposal of the all the equipments used for the renewable energy, either that is matched with the smart grid or not, or whether your study is focused upon that or not. One. The second one is the transmission loss, the energy loss, and that at the time of transmission, either it is thought while discussing about the smart grid or not. That one.
Let me take the first question.
Okay.
Yeah, the question actually is more about the Chinese government recent policy change in cutting back subsidies for renewable. Okay? I think this has been around for as a major debate in the field of renewable energy in China, because I think even some very long-time advocates for renewable energy policies, people in China, they realize that now we are up to a point of time that forever subsidies from the government is not something good. It's not sustainable for the future of renewable. For some new technologies to be sustainable, it has to be able to survive on itself. So that's why today we touch upon quite nicely on the importance of business model. So it's about the next stage of the smart grid deployment. So subsidies, rebates, that sort of policies are very critical. But next stage, if we need to scale up, then we really need to capture the capacity from the business sector, the market rules, market signals to make things work by themselves. So I think the Chinese government make that move on to a certain extent because of that sort of considerations.
I could attempt an answer on the transmission loss question. Well, what we see is that there's people who are in favor of a microgrid and a supergrid, let's say. So the people who are in favor of the supergrid, they would argue that you can balance, for example, in Europe, you can balance the grid and manage this flexibility, manage this intermittency of energy, renewable energy, by trading across the continent, let's say. Of course, there's more transmission losses involved in that. So that's also a reason why microgrids, one of the reasons why microgrids are a good option, is that because if you keep energy local, if you have a locally self-sustaining grid, then of course you've got less transmission. So it does factor into it like that, yeah.
I just want to remind us all, we're living in a world with extreme climate change, and actually responding to that means cutting emissions 80 to 90%. I mean, that's a fundamental transformation in terms of how we produce energy and use energy. So my answer to you, Professor Abe, is yes, both. And to you, yes, both. I mean, you're thinking about small-scale changes as well as large-scale changes. This is a dramatic transformation if we're to respond to the climate change issues, if we're to create a sustainable energy system. We're talking about governance here, and we're talking about bridging the small to the large. And I think the answer is C, all of the above.
Okay, on that note, perhaps I can bring the panel discussion to a close. We've slightly run over time. Thank you all for your participation. Thank you to the panel members, our speakers this afternoon, Daphne, Elizabeth, and Robin. And I think we've had a great session after lunch. It's always a tough time for our speakers and for the audience, but it's been a great day all in all. And let me pass over to Daphne now. I think she has a few closing comments.
Thank you, Professor Hughes, and all the panelists for joining this panel discussion. Yeah, okay. So before closing the whole conference, I would like to, on behalf of the organizing committee, once again, thank you very much to every one of you for your participation. Being with us today, substantial time commitment to this conference, and we do appreciate every one of you. And special thanks to our speakers. Many of them, they fly from many different parts of the world, and it's great effort to have all of them joining us today. Appreciate a lot of these efforts and all the participants. And today, actually, we do have quite a journey today that we started in the very morning that with Professor Abe about the digital grid concept, and then we move on to Alice's public engagement deliberative approach for dealing this very important concept. And then we learned a lot of the experience from South Korea, from Japan, from mainland China, and the US as well. And then we touch upon a wide range of issues, from technical challenges to smart solutions, to market, to regulatory, privacy issue, cultural factors as well, so a wide range of issues. And we are very happy to have perspective from not only academics, but also utilities, and also other parts like NGO friends. Okay? So we talk about a lot of very big and difficult questions, and we don't have very good answers today. But I'm sure that today is just the beginning, and we do hope that the Energy Center will serve as a platform for us to collaborate in the very near future in a continuous basis. So with this, I would like to draw the close of this conference. And then two other minor announcements. One is that as long as our speakers are okay, then we will post the PowerPoint and the video on our website. So we will send you updates about the arrangement. We'll first get the consensus from our speaker first. The last announcement is about the dinner arrangement. So speakers and invited guests, please wait for us outside in the lobby, and then we'll have the dinner arrangement. Okay. Thank you very much once again. And
can we thank Victor and Daphne?
Oh yeah, I forgot. Yeah. I actually dropped it down in my notebook. I forgot. Yeah, we have to thank our colleagues, especially Victor, Manny, and Samuel doing the translation, because they are extraordinary in many aspects. Yeah, and we thank Professor Bailey and our supporting organization, and our colleagues from the ITO has been doing the filming and video shooting for us. Big thank you to every one of you. Thank you.